Top 10 Viking myths debunked, separating fact from fiction on horned helmets and blood eagles. Picture a Viking. What comes to mind? Chances are you're imagining a towering blonde-haired brute in a horned helmet, leaping from a longship with a bloody axe, roaring about Odin. He's a character we know from movies, television shows like Vikings, and epic tales. A ferocious, one-dimensional warrior. But what if that image is almost entirely wrong? The Viking Age, roughly 793 to 1066 AD, was a complex period of profound change, exploration, and conflict. The people at its heart, the Norse, were not a monolithic horde of killers. They were farmers, poets, explorers, engineers, and arguably the most ambitious traders of their time. Pop culture has built a Viking stereotype that is far more fiction than fact. It's time to separate the myth from the historical reality. Let's pull back the curtain of legend and debunk the top 10 myths about the Vikings. 1. The myth: Vikings wore horned helmets into battle. This is, without a doubt, the most persistent Viking myth. The image of the horn-adorned helmet is so ingrained in our culture that it's the instant visual shorthand for Viking. However, there is precisely zero archaeological evidence that Vikings ever wore horned helmets. Not a single one has been found. The only authentic Viking Age helmet discovered in relatively complete condition is the Shieldmaiden helmet found in Norway. It's a simple, practical iron cap with a spectacle-like guard around the eyes and nose. No horns in sight. So where did this idea come from? We can largely thank the 19th century opera. In the 1870s, costume designer Carl Emil Doppler created horned helmets for a production of Richard Wagner's Der Ring des Nibelungen, an epic based on Norse sagas. The image was dramatic, primal, and it stuck. It tapped into earlier classical descriptions of northern barbarians, and from that point on, the horned helmet became permanent theatrical and later cinematic shorthand. Think about it logically. Horns on a battle helmet are a terrible idea. They provide a convenient handle for an enemy to grab. They would catch on stray weapons, and they make the helmet structurally weaker. The real Vikings were pragmatic warriors. Fashion that could get you killed had no place on the battlefield. 2. The myth: the blood eagle was a common, brutal ritual. This is one of the most gruesome and famous Viking practices, depicted in shocking detail in shows and novels. The blood eagle is described as a ritual execution where the victim's ribs are severed from their spine and their lungs are pulled out through the openings, creating a pair of wings. It's a horrifying concept, but was it real? The answer is maybe, but it's highly improbable it was a common practice. The blood eagle is mentioned in only a handful of late Norse sagas and poems, written hundreds of years after the Viking Age and well into the Christian period. There is no contemporary archaeological or historical account of it ever being performed. Historians are divided. Some argue it was a real, though exceptionally rare, ritual reserved for the most hated enemies. Others, however, believe it was a literary invention. It may have been a grand misunderstanding of complex Old Norse poetry, or kennings, where a phrase like carving an eagle on a back was a poetic metaphor for a conventional death in battle, later interpreted literally. It's also possible it was Christian propaganda, written by later authors to portray their pagan ancestors as monstrously barbaric, to highlight the saving grace of their new faith. While Viking raids were undeniably brutal, the cinematic blood eagle was almost certainly not a standard part of their arsenal. 3. The myth: they were filthy, unkempt barbarians. The dirty barbarian trope is a common one for any historical other. We imagine Vikings as caked in mud, blood and grime, with matted beards and smelling terrible. The historical and archaeological evidence, however, paints a very different picture. In fact, compared to many other cultures in Europe at the time, the Vikings were practically obsessed with grooming. Archaeologists have unearthed vast numbers of grooming tools from Viking gravesites. These aren't weapons. They're tweezers, razors, finely decorated combs, the most common find, and ear spoons for cleaning wax. The Norse even had a specific day for bathing, Laugadaga, or washing day, which is the origin of the modern Scandinavian words for Saturday, like lørdag in Norwegian. We even have written accounts from their contemporaries. The Arab diplomat Ibn Fadlan, traveling in the 10th century, was disgusted by some of their habits, like sharing a washing bowl, but he did note that they washed every morning. Conversely, the 13th century English chronicler John of Wallingford complained that the Vikings were too clean. He wrote that their habits of combing their hair daily, bathing weekly, and changing their clothes frequently made them dangerously attractive to English noblewomen, who were easily seduced away from their less fastidious Anglo-Saxon husbands. 4. The myth: the Vikings were a single, unified nation. We talk about the Vikings as if they were one people, a single nation-state like the Romans or the Egyptians. This is fundamentally incorrect. There was no country called Viking land. The term Viking or Vikinger wasn't even a nationality, it was a job description. It literally meant a person who goes on a raid or a person on an expedition. The people of the Viking Age were Norsemen or Norsewomen, hailing from distinct regions that would eventually become the modern-day countries of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. These groups were often in conflict with each other. A Viking was a trader, farmer, or artisan who, for a season, took to the seas for Viking, which could mean raiding, but just as often meant exploring or trading. Think of it this way. A man from a fjord in Norway might farm his land for most of the year, but in the summer, he joins a longship crew to trade for silver in the east or raid a monastery in the west. When he's on that ship, he's a Viking. When he's home, he's a farmer. Most Norse people never went on a raid and spent their entire lives as farmers, fishermen, or craftspeople. 5. The myth: all Vikings were towering, blonde-haired giants. This is the classic physical stereotype. Every Viking man was a 6'5" giant with flowing blonde hair and piercing blue eyes. While Old Norse culture did value tall stature and fair hair, the genetic reality was far more diverse. First, skeletal remains from the Viking Age show their average height was around 5'7" for men and 5'3" for women. This was actually tall for the time. Many of their European contemporaries were shorter, but it's hardly the race of giants depicted in fiction. They were well-fed and had a protein-rich diet, which certainly helped, but they weren't supermen. Second, the all-blonde idea is a complete myth. Large-scale genetic studies of Viking remains have shown a surprising amount of diversity. Yes, blonde hair was common in Scandinavia, but brown and red hair were just as prevalent, if not more so in some regions. Furthermore, the Vikings were master traders and travelers. They assimilated people from all over the world, including Celtic, Slavic, and Anglo-Saxon populations. This gene flow went both ways. Many people with Irish and Scottish DNA were brought back to Scandinavia, further diversifying the gene pool. There was no single Viking look. 6. The myth: armies of shieldmaidens fought alongside men. Thanks to characters like Lagertha in the show Vikings, the Shieldmaiden has become one of the most popular modern Viking tropes. The idea of warrior women fighting shoulder to shoulder with men is a powerful one. The sagas are full of them, with names like Brynhilda and Hervor, who take up arms and lead men in battle. The historical reality, however, is far more complex and debated. Norse women had a remarkable degree of freedom and power compared to their counterparts in Christian Europe. They could own property, inherit land, initiate a divorce, and run the farm or business while the men were away. They were not passive figures. But did they fight? The sagas are literature, not historical transcripts. Think of them as the superhero movies of their day. They are legends meant to entertain. For a long time, historians dismissed shieldmaidens as pure fantasy. However, a famous 10th century grave in Birka, Sweden, has challenged this. The grave belonged to a high-status warrior, buried with a full set of weapons: sword, axe, spears, and 2 horses. In 2017, DNA analysis confirmed the skeleton was biologically female. This proves that at least one woman was buried with the full honors of a warrior. But one grave does not make an army. The current consensus is that while it was not impossible for a woman to be a warrior, it was exceptionally rare, not a commonplace part of Viking society. 7. The myth: Vikings only raided, pillaged, and plundered. The very word Viking is synonymous with raider. Their historical debut, the 793 AD raid on the monastery at Lindisfarne, cemented this reputation. They were, without question, brutal and effective pirates who brought terror to the coasts of Europe. But raiding was only one small part of their identity and economy. First and foremost, the Vikings were traders. They were the engines of the global economy of their time. They established and controlled vast, sophisticated trade routes that connected the world in ways it had never been before. Norse traders sailed south to Constantinople, which they called Miklagarða, east down the Volga River to trade with the Arab world for silver, and west to Iceland, Greenland, and even North America. They didn't just move goods, they founded major cities that began as trade hubs, including Dublin in Ireland, Kiev in Ukraine, and Jorvik, modern-day York, in England. The sheer volume of Arabic coins, Byzantine silks, and Frankish glass found in Scandinavia is a testament to their commercial, not just martial, success. Raiding was a high-risk, high-reward venture. Trading was the long-term business that built lasting wealth. 8. The myth: all great warriors were sent off in flaming ships. It's the ultimate cinematic send-off. The fallen hero is laid in his longship, piled with his weapons and treasures, and the ship is pushed out to sea as a flaming arrow ignites it, a blazing pyre against the sunset. This dramatic funeral did happen, but it was incredibly rare, reserved for only the most powerful and wealthy chieftains or kings. A longship was the most valuable and technologically advanced thing a Viking could own. It was a war machine, a cargo vessel, and a status symbol all in one, representing thousands of hours of skilled labor and resources. To burn one was an act of conspicuous consumption, the equivalent of a modern billionaire being buried with their private jet. The vast majority of Norse people received much simpler burials. A common practice was a ship setting, where stones would be arranged on land in the shape of a ship to outline the grave. Most people were either cremated and their ashes buried, or they were interred in the ground, or inhumation, with a few personal grave goods they might need in the afterlife. A knife, a comb, a few beads, or a drinking horn. The flaming ship funeral was the exception, not the rule. 9. The myth: berserkers were magic-fueled super warriors. The legends tell of berserkers, warriors who fought in a state of ecstatic, uncontrollable fury, known as berserker gang. They were said to bite their shields, howl like animals, be immune to fire and steel, and possess superhuman strength. Pop culture often attributes this to drinking special potions or ingesting psychoactive mushrooms like Amanita muscaria. Berserkers were almost certainly real, but they weren't magic. They were likely a form of shock troop, an elite warrior cult probably dedicated to the god Odin. They would work themselves into a trance-like fury before a battle to intimidate the enemy and fight without fear or regard for their own safety. How did they do this? The magic mushroom theory is popular but has little direct evidence. Some scholars suggest other hallucinogens like henbane were more likely. However, other theories are more grounded. The fury could have been a form of self-induced hysteria or a ritualistic psychological technique, enhanced by fasting, hyperventilation, and ceremonial dances. Some even theorize it could have been a manifestation of post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, where the battle fury was a dissociative state. Whatever the cause, it was a terrifying psychological and physical weapon, but it stemmed from the human mind, not from magic. 10. The myth: they discovered America and then vanished. It is a historical fact that Vikings were the first Europeans to reach the Americas, beating Columbus by about 500 years. Around 1000 AD, Leif Erikson, sailing from the colony in Greenland, established a settlement on the northern tip of Newfoundland, Canada. We know this site today as Lance O Meadows, a confirmed Norse settlement. However, the discovery narrative is flawed. The land, which they called Vinland, was already inhabited by indigenous peoples, whom the Norse called Skralingar. More importantly, the Norse didn't vanish, they left. The settlement at Lance O Meadows was small and appears to have been used for only a decade or two. It was likely intended as a base for exploring and gathering resources, like timber, which was scarce in Greenland. Why did they leave? The sagas describe conflict with the Skrælingjar, who vastly outnumbered them. Ultimately, the colony was simply unsustainable. It was too far from home, the supply lines were too long, and the opposition from the native population was too strong. It was a remarkable feat of navigation and a fascinating historical footnote, but it was a dead end. They didn't disappear, they made a practical decision to cut their losses and sail home. Conclusion: the real, complex Norse. The one-dimensional, horned, helmeted barbarian of legend is a fiction. When we peel back the layers of myth, we find a people of staggering complexity and contradiction. They were brutal pirates and sophisticated traders. They were pagan fatalists and curious explorers. They produced gritty, violent sagas and delicate, intricate jewelry. The real Vikings were farmers, sailors, merchants, poets, and yes, sometimes warriors. They were a people on the move whose energy and ambition redefined the world they lived in, connecting continents and leaving their genetic and cultural mark from Russia to Canada. The truth, as it often is far more fascinating than the fiction.